Well, hello! Today I want to talk about an exciting old pen. This is one I got through a trade with Ove Bjornsson, who's an occasional commenter here on the channel. This is a classic among fountain pens. This is the Parker 51. This is a pen that was developed in 1939 by the Parker Pen Company and actually went on sale in 1941, which is a little awkward because of that whole war going on right then. But just look at this pen and put yourself in the mind of somebody in 1941 and imagine this. It's like something from the future. Pens in 1941 did not look like this. Pens in 1941 may have looked more like this. A Parker Vacuumatic, which is a kind of the predecessor and for a while was sold alongside the Parker 51. You know, a large nib, nice exposed feed, you know, very showy material. Well, that's kind of more what we're looking at. You know, and even through the 1950s and 60s, that was, well, even in the present day, that was still a thing. I mean, here's an Esterbrook, same thing. Big nib, exposed feed, fancy material. And a lot of people like that look. So, very futuristic. Nothing like it at the time. Now, you may ask why the name Parker 51. Well, the reason is, in 1939, that was the 51st year of the Parker Pen Company. And bonus, you ever try translating a name to another language that can be difficult? Imagine you're a Chevrolet selling a car called the Nova. Well, that's pretty awesome. Let's go sell it in, you know, the stars exploding and all that futuristic stuff. Let's go sell it in Mexico. Oh, Nova means don't go or doesn't go. Whoops. So 51 avoids those translation and cultural issues. So yeah, that's why they went with it. So you might be saying, okay, hooded nib, we're just being cool. I mean, the Lamy 2000 is that Bauhaus design. In fact, this is kind of an ancestor of the Parker 51. Although this is a Parker 51. This is kind of an ancestor of a Lamy 2000, but it goes off in its own way. I will be addressing that topic in a future video. So yes, I know there are several pens I could mention there. I will not at this time. But it was not just an aesthetic choice. The reason Parker went with this, well, there were several reasons. Let's start from the top. First of all, this pen was patented by Marlin S. Baker in 1939. He was an engineer before anything. He wasn't really a designer, and he followed this dictum of form follows function. Well, let's look at the function. This hooded nib is actually a big piece of it. That was not patented by Marlin S. Baker. That was patented by somebody named Russell T. Wing, separately in 1939. But and then the patent was sold to Parker, and I forget the exact financial arrangement. I didn't write it down. But if you look at that, not much of a nib there. In fact, if I were to smash this plastic up and let you look at the nib, there's not much nib there. Just a teeny weeny bit of feed sticking through. It is a gold nib, so that's pretty nice, but it isn't much. Now what this does, that you can't see in here, but I brought along some visual aids, is it allows you to put your internal reservoir inside at the nib. Alright, so I want to just briefly pull back and show you an imitator. Whoops, out of focus imitator apparently. So here's my out of focus imitator. This is a Russian pen, Soviet pen I should say. It wasn't called Russia at that time. This one was bought purely as parts. If I were to pull off the cap, you would see that the nib is missing because reasons, partly to do with this video. But yeah, same design. But what I really wanted to point out is the guts that I pulled out of it. And by the way, just to satisfy anyone's curiosity, which they may or may not have, about this Russian pen. So That's the name. All right, so anyway, what you have here is a collector. This is roughly the same design as the Parker. I don't feel comfortable taking the Parker apart right now because it is a more complex pen, plus it's inked up. But you have a collector. Now what the collector does, we'll look at this Parker Vacuumatic to get an idea. Okay, actually that doesn't show enough. Let's take a look at this other pen I brought over. This is a not terribly clean for reasons pen, but now all of this here, these fins are designed, if you have excess ink, it fills in your fins rather than drip out the end. So imagine we could contain all of this. You know, I put tape over this or something. Now we've eliminated an evaporation problem. If we cover all of this in the front, we've eliminated evaporation there. You know, we expose that much of the nib, evaporation's eliminated. So the idea was, behind this nib, we prevent evaporation. Now this was handy if you're using a fast-drying ink. And Parker happened to have come out with, well, first it was called 51 ink, which is a very alkaline ink, which would also ironically eat celluloids and such. Awkward. And then in what, about I didn't write the date down, but let's say 1948 or so, they came out with super chrome ink, which is also pretty ferocious, also very fast drying. And this design kept it from evaporating. Now, if this was the Parker nib, this piece would be gold, the nib would be gold. It would still have this very slender feed, then the collector around it. And so this feed is pretty much, if I could pull it out, which it seems to be pretty firmly attached inside this Russian pendant. I don't want to damage it until I'm ready. But it's a very long, slender feed, basically with one channel in it. And then the ink collector here serves the function of the fins. Think of the feeds like in a platinum Preppy, or the ebonite or plastic version of the feed that's in a Pilot Varsity. All right, so that was handy. So I'll set this piece aside because there is actually more to come with that. Now, other kind of interesting thing, we pull up so you can get a better look. Most pens of that era had a screw cap mechanism. Now that didn't take me too long to pull it off. Some would take a little longer, but you know, nothing too horrible. This, unlike most fountain pens of the era, that's all there is to it. It was just a push cap. It makes it very fast to deploy. The advantage of this one over a lot of what was on the market at the time was this one was a lot more secure. You know, there's a little clutch ring here. That's what the function of this piece here is. You'll notice in some of the more modern Hero versions of this pen, they've actually adapted this and put plastic in it so it's a slight ink window so you can see how much ink is remaining in your pen. Now, to fill the pen, until 1948, you were using a Vacuumatic filler, which is the same filler used in this pen, which is called the Parker Vacuumatic. And all it is, I will go into the mechanics of it when I review this pen down the road, but there's a little bladder in here that's being pushed up and down that's just slowly filling in the ink as you push on that. But like I said, that was until 1948. In 1948, it was replaced with an aerometric filler, kind of like a Pilot Con 20. So let me unscrew this. So you press this bar here, and there's a bladder inside. And it actually, if you were to read these instructions, to fill, press the ribbed bar firmly 4 times, holding pen point down. Wipe point with soft tissue, which obviously I've done because it's full of ink. Usually this is a clear bladder, and actually over time, since I've gotten this, it's become a little more clear. I think there was just some staining on it. I'm not sure, actually. It looked very black when I got it. But anyway, so I'm enjoying it. And there's actually another feature on this filling mechanism that I will come back to. Now, inside, what you can't see is a breather tube. Now, in a modern pen, you have probably seen the breather tube on the Noodler's Ahab. So what the breather tube does is it actually helps the ink get taken up faster than it's expelled. You know, the ink can come up this and then splash down and fill the reservoir, and then you can keep going rather than squirting ink out every time. It does make it kind of a bugger to clean out, though. I will admit that's one of the drawbacks to the Parker 51 is it does take forever to clean out. Now, this is a plastic breather tube. In this Russian pen, that was the part I mentioned earlier, also a plastic breather tube. In your Parker 51, it is a metal breather tube. I don't know if there's an advantage to it, but, you know, the plastics of the day, there may have actually been an advantage. It may have been more durable, I don't know. All right, we'll set all that aside. Now, because I'm unwilling to truly dissect my baby here, I'm going to link you to somebody who's much better at dissecting. I'll link you to a video by Grand Mia Pence. The footnote reference should be popping up down there on the screen as I say this. And I am trying to footnote most of this. I'll give you a little bit more in a bit, but what I want to do now is do some writing. Because that's what we're here for. I mean, all the engineering is cool, but if the darn thing won't write, what's the point? And I'm running toward the end of this, but I'm not there yet. So we'll get a little closer. And I'm uncapping the wrong pen. So I'm using Dea Trementis Blackberry, and now I feel like I need to dial up the exposure, because that looks black on the screen. Okay, and that's the trouble with this camera, is it's basically an automatic exposure. Alright, so as far as writing with this pen, it's reasonably smooth. It's not out of this world smooth. But one thing you'll notice, not a whole heck of a lot of line variation. Well, there's a good reason for it. Part of it has to do with the hooded nib. It just doesn't leave much room for line variation. Another reason is, put yourself in 1941. There is no photocopier in your office. Your office may have a ditto machine, but there's no photocopier. And the dittos, you can't just lay your copy in it and photocopy it. So what had to be done back then is a lot of carbon paper. Now, I find it difficult to find carbon paper nowadays. I actually use it for one of my chemistry labs. I have a package of it, and I'll be another hunt when it runs out. But we just don't use carbon paper much anymore. Well, back then, this was a very common thing. So this is a pretty firm nib that's actually able to handle carbon paper. That's why. All right, so let's see, some other things. Wetness and flow. I find this particular pen is very wet. This pen doesn't run out. It just keeps going and going and going. We'll do a smear test, which is as much a function of the ink as it is of the pen. This particular ink tends to be, it'll soak into the paper and it's somewhat feathery. Yeah, pretty wet. Reverse rating, as I've mentioned before. This is always a surprise to me as much as it is to you. I'd call that an extra fine. And I just realized I've had half that off the screen this whole time, so I apologize for that. I forget. All right, so we probably would like me to pull back and do a small quote. And I did manage to find a quote related to the topic somewhat vaguely. We will thank Frank Lloyd Wright for this quote. Now, if you're looking on the used market, these pens are still fairly easy to find. You can start them anywhere. You can find them anywhere, usually starting around $50 on up, depending on how common the color is and other various features. If that's out of your budget, you can find a hero version of this pen. Now, I have to caution you that there are better and worse hero versions. I have a review of that pen elsewhere on the channel. It's the Hero 616, I think. One version of it is quite nice, although it is a steel nib. The other version is a chintzy, unreliable thing. So you can get a version of this pen. But I want to go back, because I always like to talk about value. I want to go back to 1941. If you were to purchase this pen new in 1941, it would cost you about $15. Now, to me, that's a cheap pen. I mean, the Pilot Metropolitan would cost me about that. But that's 1941. Let's bring that forward to today. That would be about $240. Ouch. That's an expensive pen that I've got laying right here. Now, if back then you would have bought one of the really nice ones that was gold-filled and whatnot, you might have paid $50 back then. That's right around $900 now. Ouch! I've never paid $900 for a pen. There's one pen I kind of like to have that still doesn't quite cost $900. Getting close, but not quite there. Don't own it, for obvious reasons. Now, I've heard from people, a lot of people don't like this pen because it doesn't have all those cool fountain pen features. It doesn't have the cool finish, doesn't have the nifty nib, it doesn't have the really cool filling mechanism. It's just a simple pen that works. In fact, these work for decades. But I'm going to link to a video, and I'll let the person there give you his details. But apparently, if we were to make this pen now, as of 2002, when this was figured out, so it's now 15 years later, so up the cost a bit. But in 2002, it would have cost about $370 for the cheap version of this pen. Guess what? This guy's never paid $370 for a pen. Wow! And that's for the cheapest version of it. For the really good versions of the Parker 51, it would have cost about $650 in today's dollars to sell a pen and make money doing so. And this is a pen that was on the market until 1972, and I know production costs were part of why Parker discontinued the pen. It was a popular pen, but they're expensive buggers. Now, you might be looking at that pen here in these dates. So we've got anywhere between 1941 to 1972, which this pen could be from. Well, how do we figure out what year it's from? Well, up until 1948, they used the vacuumatic filler. As you saw, this is not a vacuumatic filler. Now, I'm looking for the date code on this pen. And I'm going to slip the magnifier on just briefly. There's not really anything to magnify on the 51, but I'm going to show you the date code on the vacuumatic, and I can't recall exactly what it means, That's one of those things I have to write down because it's just not important to me. Except when I'm doing a video like this. So right there, you see those 3 dots? That's a date code on this Parker Vacuumatic. So if your 51 is old enough, you have a date code to figure out how old it is. This 51 is not old enough. Or I'm sorry, yeah, it isn't old enough. So I have to look at some other clues. So this just comes from a little bit of history. Richard Binder is a very helpful website, and he's done a lot for the pen community. He's done a lot of the research and things that mere mortals like me just don't do. This is what they would call a Mark I of the aerometric era, and the way you can tell is the plastic tip on the filler. Other versions of this, newer versions, would have a metal tip. So that actually kind of limits it. Another thing we can see on this pen, let's see if I can aim it right. Yeah. See how you see light through there? There is a breather hole on the barrel. In the late 1950s, that breather hole was moved to the side of the barrel. So that puts my pen somewhere in the early to mid 50s. So now this was a very influential pen. You can see the influence of the hooded or semi-hooded nibs in a lot of different pens. You'll be seeing an Aurora 88 here in a few weeks. You'll be seeing a Columbus 65 not too long after. I like these minimalist pens. I like these hooded and semi-hooded nibs. I think I've mentioned before there's particular aesthetic that I like, the very minimal pens of the 60s and 70s. A lot of that comes back to this pen saying, it's okay. In the automotive world, maybe the Ford Taurus would be an example. Here's this curvy, kind of cool car in an era of boxy cars, and suddenly everybody's doing curvy cars. That's kind of what this pen did. It opened up the floodgates for all the others. Now, many of them are famous for good reason in their own right. The Aurora 88 deserves its own place, and that's why it's one reason it'll get its own video. In fact, I prefer the Aurora 88 over this guy. Columbus 65 isn't nearly as well known at all. Definitely deserves its place. The Lamy 2000 definitely deserves its own place. So they did their own thing. And like I said, even Hero with its 616, which may have even been made with some of the same equipment as was used with these guys, deserves its own place because Hero has done its own thing with it. The ink window, I think, really nice touch. So this is an influential design. Now, yeah, maybe you're not into these minimalist pens, but oh, finial. It's kind of a pearl-like thingy. Yeah. Trust me, I don't feel like, yeah. Anyway, it deserves its own, it deserves its place. And we won't see this pen made again because, as I said, the cost for this pen is prohibitive. And when you look at that end of the market, people aren't looking for a minimal pen like this, a functional pen. They're looking for a showy, gaudy pen. I mean, the Aurora 88 is no longer the simple pen it was back in the 1940s and 1950s. The Aurora 88 now has a nice big nib, and it's being sold. Yes, you can get the minimal black ones, but it's also being sold in all kinds of gaudy finishes. I do kind of like the Soleil finish. So you're not seeing it at the price point of, what did I say, of $240 or, God forbid, $900. You just don't see that anymore. So neat little piece of history right here. Neat little piece of engineering. So I hope this was useful, and I would encourage you to look through my bibliography that goes with this video and just get a better idea what is out there about the Parker 51. This really was a revolutionary pen for its time. So I thank you for watching. We'll see you later. Bye-bye.